Good evening. This is Debra V. Wilson. It's Saturday, the 21st of July, 2018. The time is 1700 hours and 45 minutes, and that's GMT minus 6. And speaking of GMT, I have started the process of working on booking my ticket. I'm doing some traveling to the UK, and I also hope to travel to Israel to make a visit to Israel. Working on the process of working on it for other people would be really a simple task. Alas, it has not proven to be the case for me. I'm not the most computer friendly person, so in any case, I am getting closer to my travels to the UK and to Israel, returning to Israel for a visit, and I'm very excited about both. My history with the UK is that I traveled there initially as an Anglophile, but because I'm not a person that's good at sitting idly by, almost immediately after I started traveling to the UK, I started a volunteer career that lasted a quarter of a century. It was a very I don't know if you could just hear that sound. I was raising the volume, so if you did hear it, that's what it was. But in any case, it's very important for me to participate in my citizenship in the country of my birth and my global citizenship, the countries that I live in, visit, Right, that's very important to me. So, one of the things I was thinking about is I've followed with great interest the UK's national security model. And there have been times that there have been components of it that I have not agreed with, that I have been critical of, and for good reason. There are also been instances in which I've had close encounters with the British national security model, and that turned out to be very productive for me as an activist, and I suspect because it was ongoing, it was productive for the state. And so this is not quite a stream of consciousness. One of the categories I have in my YouTube channel is where I do an opinion piece, and so it's opinionated. It's opinion. So that's what this is going to be. One of the things I've got a particular frustration with about the United Kingdom, and I think it might be because of the nature of the beast being people that work in the intelligence realm. I'm talking about, when I was working in the UK as an activist, they were special branch out of the Metropolitan Police. So special branch was aware of me because I was in Dundalk, and I was engaged to a man in Dundalk. So, I've in another podcast, which I'll link, the circumstances in which I left Dundalk. So, in any case, there were complex circumstances when I left Dundalk, and as soon as I returned to the U.S. safely, thank God, because of a lot of people, the wonderful assistance of a lot of people, which I will forever be grateful to, I found that I was more impassioned about my activism in the UK. So here's the thing, I looked at the world through the eyes of a civilian. So it seemed obvious to me that after I had survived this experience in Dundalk and had an understanding I would have never anticipated of a conflict from a personal perspective, that I wanted to go back to the UK. I had friends in Dundalk that were quite shocked that I was going to travel to the UK, but why wouldn't I? That's what I thought. So anyway, I traveled to the UK, and when you get off the plane, you go through immigration, and when I went through immigration, there was an old white man of Heathrow, I call him, it was the start, who literally, I gave him my passport. Kind of don't think I even needed to do that in terms of identification, but of course they need to stamp it. But I gave him my passport, and his response was, and I quote, what are you doing here? And to use my mother's words, she was quite the Southern woman, very elegant. His tone was quite nasty indeed, and it was frightening. And the next thing that happened, well, I told him I was there to see my friend and return to my activism. Again, I'm a civilian. That's not how he looked at it. So for, I would say, at least a year, maybe longer, because I was traveling to London 3 to 4 times a year, my luggage was always delayed. It was always delayed. I mean, it was always delayed. And then one trip, it wasn't delayed. While all this was going on, I continued my activism. And then one day, I came into the UK. Chronologically, I'm skipping some spaces. I came into the UK, and it was an old white man of Heathrow who was standing, and everybody else was seated. He had a white shirt on, and he asked me if I worked for a U.S. intelligence agency. He said the acronym, 3-letter acronym, and actually I didn't know what he was referring to. Of course I'd heard of the agency, but I didn't know what he was referring to, and I kept repeating it over and over again, and he said sarcastically, yeah, that's what I said. And then I realized what he thought I worked for. He thought I was a component of the U.S. state constructed security model. And I said, I started crying because I said, no. And he asked me why was I going in and out of organizations. And I always take notes. And because that's what I do, and I'm an activist, and I want to understand what's happening in London. And the only way to do that is to talk with people. So we went back and forth, and I was crying, right? And then at one point, I could see that he was looking at me. In hindsight, I remember him looking at me to judge the veracity of my tears. And then he asked me a question about some of the research I was doing. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, correctly, he said, oh no, Madam knows exactly what I'm talking about. Madam is clever. Madam is is quite clever indeed. Welcome to the United Kingdom, Madam. Enjoy your stay and have a safe journey home. And he gave me my stamped passport. Well, there's a whole backstory to the people I told about what he did, because I didn't know what the heck that was. And then at the end of it, telling me I was clever. So let's fast forward. I continued to travel to the UK. I continued to do my activism, looking at the way marginalized communities, particularly some Muslim communities, experience national security modeling, and how their responses to those experiences impacted and affected our collective security, which includes the national security model. I also looked at feminist organizations, civil society actors, feminists, and how they responded to national security modeling, and how that impacted not just community resilience, which of course is important, and indeed I would argue that the activism itself is an indicator of a high degree of resilience to contribute and want to help keep a nation safe, keep a community safe, is, I think, a sign of a great deal, a high level of resilience. So I continued to interview myriads of people. I joined new organizations that were involved doing the same thing I was doing. And every time I came into the airport, I was interviewed by an older white man, always standing, always, and it was always a man. This went on for years. And I'm jumping over some things only because I feel like I don't need to jump over them, but since I'm going back to the UK, God willing. In any case, I asked an activist, a well-known activist, who these men were, because they were all old and they were all white. Not judging, in my 60s, but I was just, and at the time I was in 40s and then 50s. But I was just curious about who they were and how they approached their questioning, which was, except for that first time, then I had a couple of incidents where I had arguments with them. But you know what? I was able to get into the country. I was able to do my work. It was, um, so now here I go again, the tears fall. In any case, um, what ended up happening is those men were special branch. And what ended up happening is because of the contact I had with them constantly, I told feminists about it, and I remember telling one of them that I was going to tell the feminists that I worked with what they were asking me, and he said, "You do that." So I did it, right? I was going to do it anyway. But the interesting thing that happened, it made me a stronger and a better activist. I'm already intellectually inclined. I'm very good at documenting. But another thing that happened that was fascinating, was the transparency. So I knew that I was going to be questioned by the state. It was always 30 minutes or less. It was overwhelmingly, highly respectful with all these boundaries and all this stuff. Feminist activists knew. The people that I interviewed, I was always transparent with the fact that if you're going to do something crazy, it's going to be short-lived, because I'm being interviewed by Special Branch every time I come in the country, and I will report it if they haven't caught it already. And it was quite productive, and it was a realistic for me in terms of engagement, because it was an engagement with the state, and an aspect, a component of the state that, I don't know how to say this without saying it, but for whatever reason, stayed within the lines during that time period, and they knew their job, they knew how to ask questions, they knew how to get to the point. Often the conversations were one-sided, but I could ask questions. They were respectful of the research I did. They asked intelligent questions about the research I did, but everybody knew. Everybody knew. I knew they were doing it. The feminist organizations I work with, I told them. The people I interviewed, I told them. And it was very interesting. I know policing and intelligence work is very complex, and there's a myriad of models that are needed to keep a nation safe. I understand that. But I understood, and I actually lived, how wonderfully productive that particular model was. With a great deal of frustration. I don't know why Special Branch never was able to acknowledge the work they did with me that I did with them. That was wrong, because they did very good work. They did very good work. They were ethical, they were respectful, they were highly intelligent. I cry all the time. I remember getting emotional about something and talking about it. It was nothing the Special Branch officer did, and I started crying. And to watch the way in which he handled it, which was very respectful, and he stayed on point and did his job. When I still lived in the States, I've had careers in corporate. I was in Chicago, corporate America, specifically corporate Chicago. Worked in accounting, finance, and human resources. I've supervised people, I've hired people, and unfortunately I've had to terminate people and from their positions. And my work around in the management of people is now analyzing their skill sets and their ability, and how they understand their role in their job, and how that's reflected in the way in which they perform it. So that's a frustration for me. I understand that the counterterrorism people typically need to be discreet, but one of the things I have to say, of all people, and the irony of life is that politically I'm very different than Tommy Robinson, but because of Tommy Robinson, what he has alleged about his encounters with, he referred to them as the secret police. I refer to them his special branch. It gave me the space to, he gave me the space to come out with my encounters with them. And I think I would agree with Britain that Britain has a very complex set of security needs, very challenging, multidimensional, multifaceted, and I don't think this Brexit business helps at all. I don't, personal side note. And I think that when the state gets it wrong, the state needs to be criticized, and robustly so, because you choose to take these jobs. So if you choose to take these jobs, they have to be done well and they have to be done correctly. When you get it right, I think we should be highly respectful. I think when you make mistakes, we still need to be in a place of respect, but to let you know, because that impacts our collective safety, all of us. If I made an accounting mistake, okay, do a journal entry, a new journal entry. If someone in counterterrorism makes a mistake, it can have dire consequences that are literally life and death. So I can't emphasize enough how important I think it is that there should be places from the government and from civil society, the people that terrorist police and the agents and officers are tasked to serve and protect, that they have to be willing to hear how we understand how they're doing their job. So after saying all that, I think it's also important that when something works, I don't know if this particular model of engagement, special branch used with other people, I don't know. In the circle in which I traveled, no one was aware of another situation like mine. One of the anomalies about my situation, I didn't live in the UK and I wasn't a British citizen, so I had the contact with them at the always initial contact at point of entry. So I don't know, I mean, I know there are other foreign nationals that were engaged in activism, but I don't know if they had a similar engagement or encounters with special branch. I don't know how they can do it, but I think they should do it. I think the ways in which it's worked with the community and worked with activists, I think you need to own that and understand that when you got it right. The business with Dundalk, I was never questioned about that because that was very complex, and that was just an extremely complex situation. And in terms of my involvement in it, the resolution for me happened when I left Dundalk safely, and that involved lots of parties and of all stripes, some within the state, some who were paramilitary persons, some who were friends. But so I always was respectful of that as well, because there's that complexity, and they never asked about that in those 30-minute questions. It was about my research and my activism in the UK. So I'm trying to, in case the few people that listen to my podcast, and of those few people, the even fewer people who have a bit of insight about the journey I've been on. Can't go back in the past. You can only learn from the past and then carry over. In that light, the good stuff, what worked, what was functional, what was productive, there's nothing I'm going to do as an individual to bring any component of special branch or what is now counter-terrorism police. I saw that Paul Golding video. Are they SO15? I'm going to have to acclimate myself to the new name. There's nothing that I'm going to do to bring them to the light, because that's an anathema to their very existence. They're like vampires. Shun the light. right? But I think it's very important for the state to understand when a model has been highly productive, and that when it has been possible for the state and a civilian that may be politically differ and not always in agreement, that there are partnerships that can be made, and those partnerships can be made in spaces of mutual respect and understanding that are good for the collective good. This is Debra V. Wilson, and I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and that's in Canada. It is Saturday, the 21st of July, 2018, and the time is 1800 hours and 4 minutes. And once I book my ticket, I haven't even tried the Israeli portion of it. Once I book my tickets, I will give a shout, because I'm very excited to see my friends in the UK, my colleagues, and then I have friends in Haifa, and I'm very excited. And there's 2 feminist organizations in Haifa that I'm absolutely crazy mad about. I'm in love with them. Kenyan Feminist Organization in Haifa, Feminist Institute. It's just absolutely amazing women and amazing work they're doing. And then, so I actually met them, and I used to go there and work do work on my projects and things. And there's an organization, Women Wage Peace, that's doing a lot of really good work that I'm looking forward to actually meeting people there face to face. And then lastly, there are people in the UK I want to interview that are retired state people. They worked in keeping the nation safe. And then there's people from the state. One person has already agreed to let me interview him, Hurrah. I won't say his name unless he tells me I can at some point. And then there's a civil society actor who's right of center and in Israel that I very much want to interview him. But I've reached out to him. I need to. Well, I think once I'm in Israel, I'll reach out again or let him know that I'll be in Israel. So anyway, that's a bit of an update. And what will I call this podcast? Shall I try to drag Special Branch into the light? I don't think so. But just acknowledging that there are places and spaces and times that it's appropriate and quite functional for the state spying apparatus to come out of the shadows and interact with the public. Again, this is Debra V. Wilson. Thank you.